Hello everyone and welcome to the first part of Chapter 10, the last chapter in this lecture series, where we conclude and summarize the entire lecture and give lots of examples and also personal examples and a good overview over the priorities when it comes to practicing Dhamma. All of this happens in the context of the lecture series True Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. My name is Dr. Florian Lau from the Dhamma Hub, and we will now dive into an overview concerning the content of this entire lecture. This lecture, at least when it comes to the overview, is rather short, as we have lots of rather long figures and sketches and illustrations on the priorities in the entire overview over the entire practice, so that the priorities of training and practice are very, very clear to you. So first of all, we start with the priorities of liberation, what you should practice at what point in time, and what is most important, what is least important for the average practitioner, which is very important. Then we have the last story time, number 10, where we talk a bit about the Arahant summits that made sure that the teachings of the Buddha are still around today. Then we have the roadmap of the Buddha when it comes to his awakening and his training, how we can actually attain liberation according to the Pali Canon, to the oldest known texts. Then we have some personal examples, how all of this went for me, to give you an idea what to expect. I do not say that my progress is very typical or anything like that, but it can at least serve as some frame of reference, as some very practical example for lay practitioners, because not everyone wants to be a monk, and many people are intimidated nowadays by practicing Dhamma and really think that it is only something that can be understood by monks, which is very much not true. It really depends on your priorities and on your practice. If you practice rightly, you will get the results, no matter what your formal title is or your formal name. You don't need a monk name, you just have to do the right things. Then we have a chapter-wise summary and a real summary of the entire lecture in the end, or a real conclusion. And in the end, we have a few words of acknowledgement and thank yous, and a few other finishing words and touches when it comes to the lecture. But anyway, let us continue. And as always, now we do 5 minutes of mindfulness meditation or non-reactivity that are completely optional. If you choose to and want to understand the content of this lecture better without being obstructed by your craving, then you can choose to do 5 minutes of non-reactivity right now. Just sit on your chair, close your eyes if you wish to, open eyes are perfectly fine too, and then just sit there, do nothing, and just make sure that you do not act out of greed, aversion, or delusion in body, speech, and mind. If you do that, you prepare the ground for further or future insights to occur. And you make sure that your mind is actually well prepared for the insight of the right view or stream entry. I will pause now for a moment and then we will continue. Okay, let us continue with the content. And first of all, we talk about the priorities of liberation, and I usually like to do that in the form of a pyramid diagram. So when it comes to the average practitioner, and this is very important, those pyramids are not for individuals, those are for average practitioners. Each individual has their own set of problems, their own set of weaknesses, and their own set of wrong views, and also their own set of natural inclinations. And all of those things have to be taken into account. Not every person has the same liberation of mind. While we all use the same underlying principles, namely the elimination of ignorance of the 3 marks and the elimination of craving through the elimination of ignorance, not every individual path is in detail the same as the paths of other people. However, in the beginning, there is something that is almost shared among all individuals, namely a divine messenger event that sparks your interest in spirituality. There has to be a reason for you to start your noble search for a way out of suffering. When there is no such reason, no such event that sparks that interest or makes it a matter of vital concern, then there is no reason that you should leave your household life behind, and there is no reason that you see the danger or the problem with indulgence in sensuality. So many people need a rather traumatic event, either the death or sickness of a loved one, your own imminent death or sickness. It's usually a very good wake-up call, or the death and sickness of a person you know. Sometimes it is even enough to just hear about sad events or tragic events in the world, but those are the rarest kind of people. And there is one kind of person, for example Ratapala from the Suttas, who is even rarer, who just hear the teachings of the Buddha, and then upon hearing that, there is a sense of urgency stirred up in those people, and they start practicing the good Dhamma and accepting that as their refuge, as the escape of arisen suffering. But for that to apply to you, you need very good past karma, to put it like that. So in the beginning, a traumatic event is usually unavoidable. You have to experience suffering that is so great that it devalues all of sensuality. And that is usually accompanied by some kind of death of either loved ones or yourself or your family or anything like that. Or even a pet in some cases. And the result of that, as the Buddha put it, is either noble search, namely searching for a solution to suffering, or madness. But in case you are listening to such a lecture, the result was very likely noble search for you, and you are looking for a way out of all the mass of suffering, as the Buddha put it, out of old age, sickness, and death. Based on that, the actual real training towards stream entry can begin. And this usually requires a lot of effort at trying to understand the teachings of the Buddha and a lot of gradual training. That gradual training consists of all kinds of steps. It starts with the divine messenger and actually having a reason to practice. Then there is a lot of virtue, a lot of trying to understand, a lot of reading of the sutras, a lot of not welcoming, delighting, and entertaining sensual thoughts, sensual prospects, not acting out of greed, aversion, and delusion, seeing the danger in the slightest fault and the slightest misunderstandings, and all those things should be practiced at that stage. This is the initial commitment. You really try to create a meditation habit, and you really try to practice as good as you can and understand as good as you can what the Buddha explained in the sutras as an example. And based on that, we can continue with keeping the precepts and cultivating a very healthy lifestyle. Because Dhamma can only really be understood on the basis of a healthy lifestyle. If you are sick and constantly suffering and in pain, then the chances are very bad that your mind is in a state where it can understand the Dhamma. The Dhamma can only really be understood in the presence of neutral feelings, in the presence of feeling neither too good nor too bad. And when you are constantly suffering, that is not the case. There will be a lot of aversion in your mind, as your mind is not yet trained enough to be above the pain, to be above the suffering. So when you are not progressed enough, then those painful conditions that can result from a very unhealthy lifestyle will be a great hindrance. And sooner or later, a practitioner will notice that some kind of virtue has to be practiced. Otherwise, there is no real progress when it comes to the Buddha's teachings. So the people who commit more to Buddhism usually start taking the 5 precepts at least more serious. And those are kind of precondition when it comes to the right view. If you still engage in killing individuals, killing living beings, animals, or anything like that, if you still rape people or cheat or steal or tell lies on a frequent basis, then the breakthrough to the Dhamma is more or less impossible for you. The Buddha was very clear on that. Keeping the precepts is what separates animals from humans. Human animals and humans. This should not be taken as a too drastic statement, but if you do not see a problem with killing, as an example, then your mind is very likely not ready to practice Buddhism. Because there is no way that you can kill without the motivation of greed, hatred, or delusion in your mind. All the precepts always have that as their basis. They try to prevent you, or they try to protect you from acting out of the worst kinds of greed, hatred, and delusion. And not acting out of greed, hate, and delusion is an absolute prerequisite for progress in the teachings of the Buddha. Then based on that, when that is also in place, you can actually start practicing enduring and sense restraint. You want to restrain your senses and do not let them follow after every sensual prospect or every sensual pleasure that presents itself. This is very important because we want to understand craving in Buddhism. And to understand craving, we have to allow it to endure in our mind. And this requires sense restraint. Without restraining our senses, we will not be able to inspect and understand the craving that is there in the mind. The problem is that it is very uncomfortable and can feel very bad in the beginning because the mind is used to getting what it wants all the time and immediately. We always immediately act out of our cravings as putujanas, as unenlightened people, so that we make the painful craving go away. But the problem is that we can never understand the craving when we immediately make it go away. So we have to learn to let bad feelings, bad emotions, and all those things, craving, endure in the mind without trying to get rid of it, trying to get more of it, or trying to distract us from it. Only then can we understand those states of mind, those parts of our experience in sufficient depth that we can actually be liberated from those things. So when we have that immediate problem, that there is some bad feeling in the mind will try to find a solution for it. And if you prevent the mind from taking the default way out, namely engagement in sensuality or distraction, then it has to look for another solution. And that only other solution that is there is the practice of the Dhamma and the understanding of the right view of dependent origination. Based on that, you can remove suffering for good. All the attempts at covering up suffering via engagement in sensuality or distraction are only temporary solutions. So suffering will always come back. There is no way to avoid that. So you want to make sure that the mind seeks for a better solution that is more durable, that, actually lasts forever, that is unconditioned. Then based on that, if you have done that long enough, you can do a lot of sutta study, and the result will be very strong mindfulness or even samadhi. And samadhi just means keeping things together. And right mindfulness always has some perception of the three marks involved. So if you are rightly mindful, there is always the aspect of anicca involved. And you want to cultivate that right mindfulness. You want to make sure that you really try to have the right mindfulness, even though you don't know what it is in the beginning. You only know right mindfulness from wrong mindfulness when you have cultivated the right view. The right view is a distinguishing factor between knowing what leads to liberation and knowing what leads away from liberation. This is the knowledge of a stream enterer. Knowing right as right and wrong as wrong. Knowing skillful as skillful and unskillful as unskillful. Knowing what leads to liberation and knowing what leads away from liberation. Those are the things that you should try to cultivate. So the initial striving is always directed at trying to attain the right view. Then, upon that, the true Dhamma begins. The Noble Eightfold Path starts with the attainment of the right view. Nothing short of that is acceptable if you actually want to get rid of suffering for good. This is very, very important. And it is very important too that you know that you have to practice Dhamma rightly for a very long time without knowing what Dhamma even is. You can only, in hindsight, notice that you have been practicing rightly upon attaining the right view. Before that, you are more or less in the dark, and you are dependent on the teachings of other people who tell you and know what is right and what is wrong, and they show you the way, so to speak. This is why the noble Sangha is so important. And this is why the triple gem is considered as such a high gift. The Buddha who discovered the Dhamma which is the teaching that can actually lead you out of suffering, and then the noble Sangha that actually keeps the teaching alive over the generations. And due to that noble Sangha, due to those people who are practicing the Dhamma rightly and keeping it alive over the generations, you too have now the very rare opportunity to actually practice in line with the Dhamma and thus find a way out of suffering permanently. Yeah, and this list, this is very important, addresses current problems, current things and current wrong views that people have when it comes to their practice. When people, in the case, in a few hundred years, watch this lecture, for whatever reason, if it makes it that long into the future, then those future generations will have other wrong views and other problems. Right now, we have a host of problems that are very unique for our time. People have misinterpreted the teachings in the Visuddhimagga and mistook them for the actual teachings of the Buddha, as an example. Thus, we have lots of wrong views when it comes to absorption jhanas and all those things that can feel very nice. Those are very real states, but they are not what the Buddha taught. And we should make a very clear distinction between those things. And future generations will have completely different misunderstandings that we cannot even think about properly right now. And those future generations have to disentangle those views as best as they can, based on what the Buddha told us and based on the teachings that the people delivered over time, so that they can actually make progress and also find a way out of suffering. So this is just important. Those priorities are in general what the Buddha taught, but they also have a touch of what is relevant right now. For example, in the past, virtue was more or less common. People were much more religious than they are nowadays. And right now they have problems and trouble keeping to things like precepts. because they see no problem with drinking alcohol. They see absolutely no problem with engagement in mindless sexual activity, as an example. But there are problems. But you have to uncover them nowadays, because our wrong views hinder us from seeing those things. So this is very important. And in the future, this will be different. There are literally an infinite number of wrong views available that we can have. And there are only very few right views. Actually, there's only one right view on dependent origination. But anyway, let us continue with the next story time, namely story time number 10, now that we know the priorities of awakening. And this story time starts with the Arahant Summit number 1, which was held shortly after the Buddha's final paranibbana. At that time, the elder Mahakassapa was the only great disciple or great Arahant disciple of the Buddha who was still alive. He was the oldest among all of those people, and I think in the end he died at the age of 120 years in the forest while still maintaining his ascetic lifestyle. And the Arahant Summit was more or less led by the elder Mahakassapa, who has been called the Buddha's equal by the Buddha at several times in the Pali Canon. And he was very intent on ascetic practices, so that was his vehicle to liberation. Those practices really helped him, and they helped many other people at the time, but they are not necessary. The Buddha always said, let those who want to practice severe asceticism practice severe asceticism. Let those who want to not practice it practice something else. So he always let the people choose whatever suited their character. And in the end, he tried to gather all the remaining living Arahants so that they could make sure and decide how to best keep the Buddha's teaching alive. And in the end, all of them gathered, and he had all the monks recite the code of conduct, the rules for monks and nuns, and the suttas. And the teaching at that time has already started to decline, and there were teachings that were not in line with what the Buddha actually taught at all. And in the beginning, Ananda was the only non-Arahant that was invited to the Arahant Summit, as he had a great memory and possessed knowledge about pretty much all the suttas that the Buddha has talked about. So he is the sole reason that we have access to pretty much all the suttas that we have nowadays, as he remembered all of them, and he recited all of them at the Arahant Summit. And shortly before Ananda wanted to go to the Arahant Summit, he made a heroic effort and actually attained Arahantship. He was about to go asleep, in a state of shame even, because he was not an Arahant yet, and he thought it was unsuitable to go there without being an Arahant. And shortly before his head met the pillow, so to speak, he attained final knowledge and became a holy one. A noble one is a stream enterer or more, and a holy one is an Arahant, at least when it comes to many translations. And the monks started to memorize with the memorizing of the monastic code of conduct, everything when it comes to virtue. Because there is no Dhamma without virtue, even though virtue is not Dhamma yet, which is also very important to keep in mind. So they started with virtue. They decided, they made an active decision that the virtue should come first, and that they should record all the teachings on virtue first. And that recitation lasted a full month. So they were all listening to that one person who recited all the rules and everything on virtue for an entire month. And then things changed a bit. So Kassapa first questioned on the Vijnana, namely the code of conduct. And then, after that first month, Kassapa next questioned Ananda on the Dhamma. And whenever he was questioned, Kassapa questioned on the setting, on the people, on the occasion, and on all the other information that are necessary to understand the context in which a sutta was given by the Buddha, so that people can actually make sense out of it. Because the cultural background, as we have learned in chapter 2, matters a lot when we try to understand the teachings. Because over time, when we look into the future, it will not be common knowledge anymore, what we did now. People will not know in the future that we watched a lot of TV and all the other cultural things, or that the internet was a thing, because there will be other structures in the future that are completely unknown and unknowable by us. So when he questioned Ananda thus, Ananda answered with all things best to his knowledge. This is why the beginning of the sutta pretty much always contains some statement on, it was that occasion. The people were meeting at Savatthi in Jetas Grove, and then there is some background information on the people that were involved in all those things, so that you can actually make sense out of those. And yeah, the majority of the discourses were remembered that way, simply because Ananda knew them all very well by heart, or the vast majority of them by heart. But some monks went by their direct memory of the Buddha's words, which is also very legit, because they have memorized those words directly from the lips of the Buddha, and they chose that it was better to go by that. But yeah, some minor or lesser rules were pretty much kept, because the people at that time were allowed by the Buddha to, abandon those minor and lesser rules, but nobody really knew what minor or lesser rules are, so they decided that they should keep all those rules, otherwise wanderers from other sects would say that everyone has already abandoned the Buddha's teachings shortly after the master's death. This was the reasoning at that time. Also, all those minor rules, like you should not cut grass or things like that, or not take garlic as gifts from other people, are not strictly speaking related to the practice of Dhamma. Those were just situational rules, and there's nothing wrong with abandoning them in theory. But they decided to keep those rules nonetheless, simply to have a better image to the outside, which would help in keeping the teachings alive. And this is pretty much how the entire Pali Canon came to be. And then there was a second council 100 years later, where another generation of Arahants met, and they added more and more to the Pali Canon. At that time, the Greek Chandragupta had gained command over the Ganges Valley. So the control over good parts of India were actually in Greek hands right now. So the Greeks had very early contact to the Buddhist teachings, as an example. People are always confused when it comes to that. They see no connection between Greece and India, and no connection between Christianity and Buddhism, but there really is one, because they had control over the entire area. The Mauryan Empire, as an example, was in that area below the Himalaya. So that was the second Arahant council, and 150 years later, there was a third council of Arahants, and they completed the Tipitaka, the entirety of the Pali Canon, which also includes the Abhidhamma books, which I'm personally not very fond of, because in essence, they are, at least in my opinion, not really Dhamma. They concern themselves with practical repetition schemes and formal analysis, but not really with the part that concerns your own experience. And in the end, that is all that matters. You can find many ways of categorizing teachings and things, but it does not matter as long as you cannot really discover those things in your own experience. And by that time, there were already 18 schools of thought, or schools of Buddhism, that had emerged. So the teachings were already spreading in various different directions. And not all of them contain the truth anymore, because at least the Abhidhamma is already very far away from what the Buddha actually taught. This is, by the way, my statement, and I take whole responsibility for saying that. So if anyone disagrees, that is perfectly fine, and you can make up your own opinion. But what is in there is strictly against what is in the suttas. So that should be kept in mind if you want to practice by what the Buddha very likely actually taught. And this concludes pretty much the entirety of the story time. Now we come to a roadmap of Buddhism, where we go through all the events step by step in even more detail than in the pyramid that we have already discussed. But before that, we have a short citation on the Dhamma, because the Buddha did say that the Dhamma is pretty much perfect. And there is nothing to add to it and nothing to remove from it, which is also very important. And this is something that the newer schools of Buddhism frequently ignore. They add to the Pali Canon, or add to the suttas that the Buddha gave all the time, and not just in a different phrasing. Different phrasings are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they fundamentally change what the Buddha taught to something very different. They redefine the word Buddha even, or many other things that are completely not what the Buddha taught. Now you can decide for yourself if that is a good thing or a bad thing. In the end, I'm very much on board that you should use timely or contemporary metaphors for teaching Buddhism, but you should not really change the hardwood of the teaching, because it is immutable. It is beyond time, beyond change. It's always the same, but you can find different words. Otherwise, we could not teach the Dhamma in different languages from Pali, but it is possible. But anyway, let us continue. So how does the sutta go? It's from Digha Nikaya number 27. But if one were to use the expression properly, he sees but does not see, it would be like this. What he sees is a holy way of life which is fully successful and perfect, with nothing lacking and nothing superfluous, well proclaimed in the perfection of its purity. If he were to deduct anything from it, thinking in this way it will be purer, he does not see it. And if he were to add anything to it, thinking in this way it will be more complete, then he does not see it. He has not understood it. That is the meaning of the saying, he sees but does not see. Therefore, Kunda, if anyone were to refer to any holy way of life as being successful and perfect, it is this holy life that he would be describing. So what the Buddha essentially said is that if you have the urge to add anything fundamental to the Dhamma, then you have not understood the Dhamma, then you have not seen the Dhamma, because it is already perfect. There's not really anything that you can add to it. Sure, you can change the look and feel of it. You can change the wording, you can change the metaphors to better appeal to people. But those things always point to the identical underlying principles. The chain of dependent origination, the structure of awakening and liberation is always the same. The Buddha said as an example that all those who attain Nibbana, he compared it with the city, come through the same gate. They all come in through the same gateway, because there is not a second one. I know that pretty much all religions in the world claim that they found the single gateway. And it is possible that they also have discovered that gateway, but that gateway must always be the same, because it can only happen through the elimination of craving, through the destruction of ignorance, through the destruction of the taints. Otherwise there is no liberation, which is also very important to keep in mind. So yeah, if you want to read up more on it, feel free to have a look at Digha Nikaya number 27, which is a rather long one. Those are the long discourses of the Buddha, and this is just a very short snippet of the entire sutta. But anyway, let us now continue with the roadmap of the Buddha, or how he most often taught liberation. At the top, you can see a timeline of 7 years, and the Buddha promised that at the end of 7 years, if you practice rightly, you will be either an anagami, a non-returner, or an arahant. And it can even happen much sooner. People like Sadhguru, for example, often say that the Buddha's teachings are very slow and fold out over many lives. But that is never how the Buddha taught. He never said that it should last long. He even said that a single excellent night is enough sometimes for some people, given the right preconditions. He also said that sometimes 7 years are enough, sometimes 7 months, 7 weeks, 7 days, a fortnight, half a fortnight, things like that. And then even a single excellent night at some occasions. So it all depends on the prior training and understanding you went through. But in the beginning, all paths are more or less the same. You pretty much always start with a divine messenger event of any kind. You must notice that there is something wrong with your way of living. Otherwise, you will not seek another way of living. That is even in stark contradiction to the prior one. Because to practice Dhamma, you cannot practice sensuality as you have practiced it before. So you need an event that devalues sensuality. And being confronted with death of any kind gives you a very vivid experience of that missing value in sensuality. And this is very important. This is very much like the prisoner simile I gave in the last chapter. The immediate prospect of death does devalue sensuality entirely. Because we can only enjoy sensuality when we are convinced on a subconscious level that those pleasures will last forever. You cannot take joy in sensual prospects when you will know that you will die the very next day. And there is no joy in the sensuality. And that knowledge of imminent death just uncovers the lack of lasting fulfillment. It has always been there, we just ignored it. And then based on that, most people will start to build a daily practice. They start their gradual training, they will start keeping the 5 precepts sooner or later, at least if they do it in the context of the Buddha's teachings, because sooner or later people will tell you that it's rather necessary for any progress to keep the 5 precepts. And then you might even have to look for a new job if you're a butcher or someone like that, who has a very, very immoral job, or a soldier who has pretty much killing as their job or as part of their job, which is not very nice. So you should actually make sure that you purify your livelihood and all the other aspects of your life so that they are at least in line with the 5 precepts. And then based on that, we can continue with our training with a lot of Dhamma study. At some point you will notice that most of the modern teachings are lacking in some aspect. And then you will start to actually dive into the suttas themselves. And some of those suttas will resonate better with you than others. And those are the suttas that you should read in more detail and try to understand in all depth. And based on that, you should also cultivate the mundane right view that we have discussed in a lot of depth in chapter 4. So you should cultivate responsibility for all actions that are rooted in greed, aversion, and delusion. You are responsible for those. You welcome them, you delight in them, you entertain them. You make sure that there is more of it in the future. You should also cultivate self-honesty, because without self-honesty, you will never even acknowledge your problems. And when you don't acknowledge your problems, you will not try to find solutions for your problems. And without that, liberation is impossible, because liberation requires us to acknowledge parts of our experience that we do not like to acknowledge. We do not like to find out about ourselves that we are quite greedy, that we are quite hateful, that we are quite agitated, that we are not knowing all, because we always think that we know best. It is just a natural human state. We know at the very gut feeling level that our opinion is right and that our opinion is a good one and all the others are lacking in some area. But when you critically examine that attitude, then you will notice that your opinion changes all the time, and not all the opinions of the past could have been right. And there is not a single reason to assume that it will be different in the future. There is also a necessity for faith in other people, because otherwise you would not practice the Dhamma. If you do not suspect that there is something to be gained by practicing the Dhamma, you would not listen to anyone, because all those woo-woo religious people could just be talking nonsense, as an example. And then you must also accept that the current state as it is your starting position. You cannot deny parts of your experience and practice the Dhamma. In the beginning, there is a sense of self, as an example, even though all the texts say that it is about non-self. There is self, and you must overcome it by understanding. Through accepting that sense of self, you lead it to a contradiction, and thus self becomes non-self. That sense of self is still there, in a sense, but it is now non-self, it is no longer yours, which is very important. And based on that, you can start practicing a lot of virtue and make sure that your mind is well prepared for the potential troubles that lie ahead, because not every insight is an easy one. The process of renunciation can be very painful depending on your indulgence in sensuality before. If you very much relied on drugs and parties and company and playing video games all the time, watching pornography and all those things, then it can actually be a very hard fall for you, because all those things will be seen as empty of any lasting pleasure in the process of practicing the Dhamma. And this can make you feel very hollow and very void, and it can even lead to a temporary nihilism, because you really notice, okay, there is nothing to be gained there. There is nothing in those behaviors that could ever make me happy. And that realization can be quite painful in the beginning. And what can dampen the fall is your training in virtue, because the training in virtue is a training in emotional non-reactivity. Then those things can happen without affecting you too much. And this is very important, because without that virtue, it can really lead to a very long dark night, as people like Saint John of the Cross have said, as an example. So you must have faith, you must cultivate virtue beforehand, and then everything can be smooth sailing. But leaving out virtue can lead to horrible results for people. So I can only emphasize that it is a very good idea to actually cultivate virtue in the sense of the Buddha, like we have discussed in chapter 5, and not in the sense of mindlessly following rules. Everyone can follow rules, but that does not make you a Buddhist or a spiritual practitioner. You have to understand why you follow those rules. And then based on that, you can actually make good progress and actually weaken your craving. And this is a foundation for the holy life. Only on the basis of virtue can you understand the Dhamma without craving. When you have no virtue, you only understand through craving, and every action of yours will be guided by trying to avoid immediate suffering. There is no other way. And then based on that, we can really try to understand, because now we are no longer pulled and pushed around by our bad and good feelings anymore. There will be more neutral feelings, more calm, and based on that, we have a fertile ground for understanding. Then we can contemplate a lot, and based on those contemplations, a lot of joy will arise, because the joy that the Buddha was talking about is more of a relief kind of joy, which is very important to keep in mind. And the simple understanding, the simple insight that you can have in meditation or during contemplation can be the source of a lot of joy, of a lot of ease, and even of a lot of bodily calm and pleasure. And you can even get some taste of the jhanas, as an example. Those are in the beginning usually states bordering the jhanas. You are not really understanding them, and when you do not understand those states, they cannot really be right, and they will not really be the real jhanas. And as I have mentioned in chapter 7, there are many states in meditation that feel very good before you even reach the state of samadhi, which culminates in jhana. So only based on all those states can you actually have jhana, but as all those states will feel like the best thing you have ever experienced, your mind will naturally jump to the conclusion that it must be a jhana. But anyway, based on that, we have a lot of smaller insights that are not really dated back to the Buddha, like the difference between mental and body, some of the foundations of mindfulness, between cause and effect, namely that there are intentions in the mind that are accompanying your actions. This is why the Buddha called action, intention, choice, intention, and all those things are very similar. Because without an intention in your mind, you cannot perform an action. That intention has to be there all the time. If the intention vanishes, the action stops. This is very important. People always think about choices, as an example, as a very temporary thing. But a choice is actually an upheld intention that is there all the time. And the action that follows from that intention, by cause and effect, can only be there as long as the intention is there. And you could always say no to that intention. At every given time, you could stop your action. You don't have to pick up a cup in front of you. At any given moment, you can say, no, I don't want to. I don't want to continue with that. And then based on that, we have the insights into the 3 marks that we really have to try and contemplate. You first discover impermanence, pretty much. Through impermanence, there will be some suffering that you experience, because impermanence means that you cannot own or control things. And upon noticing that, you will be disenchanted and you will suffer because you thought that you could control those things, that you could own those things. And that has to lead to disenchantment, and that disenchantment leads to dispassion, and that dispassion immediately has as its result the perception of non-self. So what has previously been self is now seen as non-self. And based on a lot of trying to understand of dependent origination, you will have the first glimpse or the first understanding of anicca, namely of impermanence, and see it really rightly. So by indirection, you discover what impermanence and non-self and all those things actually mean. And based on that, you understand dependent origination and break the 12-link chain that the Buddha has presented at one link. That does not mean that you have the full understanding yet of a stream enterer and a full penetration of the Four Noble Truths. But the Buddha gave us a promise that from that moment onwards, you at least have the guarantee to attain stream entry or the penetration of the Four Noble Truths in this very life. And by that definition, you are already a noble one. A noble one without the realization of the fruit, namely you have not understood the Four Noble Truths or the chain of dependent origination in relation to how ignorance leads to suffering. So the fruition, let's put it like that, of that is stream entry, where you understand how to remove suffering from your life through removing ignorance of the 3 marks. It is an understanding. You can have lots of experiences that are very similar to non-self, but without understanding those experiences, there is no Dhamma. And then, based on all of this, we have the typical progression, because now the Noble Eightfold Path starts. Now you can actually start practicing what the Buddha said. Now you will start to understand all the things that the Buddha mentioned in the suttas. All the suttas, in the matter of weeks or months, you will suddenly understand pretty much all the suttas that the Buddha laid out if you actually practiced rightly. And it is not some shallow understanding, some cherry-pick understanding like many teachers have it nowadays. It's literally you can pick a random sutta and can say why it is the same as basically all the other suttas. This is the understanding we are talking about. And then you can start practicing, for example, the way of the jhanas, progress through the jhanas, and then have the milestones or attainments of one's returner, non-returner, and then the full liberation of mind. And all of this can happen through the course of 7 years or less, if you are a diligent practitioner with good preconditions. Let's put it like that. And based on that, we have all the other possible paths that I have already displayed in another chapter. You can have a look at that again if you want to find multiple ways to full awakening that we have discussed in chapter 8, if I remember that correctly. We will not go through that part in depth again, but the first part was very important, because that is a part that most of the striving of most people should be directed at. And then the path of the jhanas is probably the most popular and best one for most people, where you try to understand the extent of the body. You want to know what part of your experience belongs to the body and not to you, and what part of experience belongs, well, to you. Yeah, let's put it like that, in lack of better words. Anyway, let us now continue. And just a very short summary of a few milestones on the path, which I deem very helpful. Let's put it like that. So the first thing that is absolutely necessary is a divine messenger event or some past karma that sparks your serious interest in the practice. As the practice of Dhamma goes against sensuality in its entirety, you need something that gives you a good enough reason to actually go against the grain of your entire existence as it was before. You need a reason to no longer look for sensual pleasures all the time. And this is usually the divine messenger event. Then you start practicing the gradual training, and the result is, or the goal is, an awakening of awareness or mindfulness. You want to gain access to the reflexive part of your experience. You must be able to do or see two things at once. This is an absolute necessity. Otherwise, you cannot directly see the womb of experience, or yoniso manasikara, as the Buddha called it. You want to see how certain specific parts of your experience are necessary for other parts of your experience to exist. And for that, you have to see two things at once. It is not possible otherwise. And to even go in that direction, you have to have some guidance by other people. So the Buddha named those two things as a precondition for attaining right view, namely womb attention and the utterance of another. Without those things, it is nearly impossible to get there. And then you want to anchor yourself on one of the four foundations of mindfulness while simultaneously observing something that you typically actively do and you know and see anicca rightly. You notice how those things that you typically actively do just happen. They continue happening regardless if you put your attention on those things or not. And this will shatter the illusion of control because those things continue, no matter if you look there or not. And once you made it that far, the result will be the right view, the breaking of the chain of dependent origination at exactly one point. So understanding anicca and dependent origination to the point where you can actually remove arisen suffering from your experience is the next milestone. It is a penetration of the Four Noble Truths. It is stream entry. I like to make a distinction there. I think it is not very often that people make a distinction there, but it reflects my experience very well. Let's put it like that. And then the last step, when you have actually attained stream entry, is just the removal of the remaining taints. The underlying disease has been removed. The poisonous arrow, as the Buddha put it, has been removed, and now you just have to make sure that the wound can heal by supplying the proper conditions for that healing. And that is no more engagement in sensuality. The Dhammapada verse is very fitting. There is nothing better for a noble one than to pull the mind back from everything that is endearing. Because based on that, the mind will cool down, the urges to move into the sensual domain will cool down, and the result will sooner or later be the full liberation of mind or arahantship. And it's also very important to keep in mind that the Buddha did not teach a single path. He taught all possible paths. He told us what not to do. The remaining things can be done. Also very important. So the individual progresses and paths can look very different while all of those people are still practicing Buddhism. But you can do nothing that goes against that directly. So when people tell you that you should actually move into the sensual domain all the time, really deep, because that is necessary for some reason, and this is for, I don't know, tantric practitioners that are householders and they need to have sex, then those are usually excuses. Those are not what the Buddha talked about. You can have the right view while you are still somewhat engaged in sensuality, but you cannot see ultimate value in that. If you really want to go there, then you are not practicing the Dhamma, because that strengthens your craving. And understanding Dhamma requires very weak craving. Okay, now we come to very personal examples of mine. And I think we will continue for a few more minutes. And this is about how I practice, strictly speaking. And my practice might be a bit different from the practice of other people, because in the end, I'm not like everyone. Everyone is an individual. And I choose a path where I also teach. And this is very important for me. Teaching is also learning for me. By formulating the teachings in a way that other people can understand it, I am learning myself. So when I create such lectures or write books, then I'm tackling the topic from multiple angles so that I can understand it better, so that I can find my blind spots and my weaknesses. And my own study or practice includes a lot of studying of Dhamma. This is not the vehicle for every person, by the way. The Buddha distinguished a face type of person and an insight or Dhamma type of person. One type of person can just follow whatever people say, and based on that they can gain understanding. But then there is another type of person, namely the insight or Dhamma person, who has to understand in depth before they can practice. You could call that even an obstruction of my mind, because I am not willing to practice without understanding. But the benefit of that is that I'm skilled at teaching. And when I'm skilled at teaching, other people can benefit from that. A face type of person can only help other face types of person. But a Dhamma type of person can also help face types and the other Dhamma types of people if they are skilled at teaching. So at least there is a benefit of other people too, which is also important to keep in mind. And when it comes to my practice, it is not just that I sit formally on the meditation cushion and meditate. I do still sit. I don't have to technically sit, and I'm not following any mechanical instruction of meditation anymore, like the methods of Lee Brazing to generate pleasure. I don't do that anymore, but I still like to sit. I still like to have the calm, like to have the neutral feelings as a ground for further insight. Because as a person who is practicing for full arahantship, as an example, you have to see the 3 marks in every part of your existence. And that sometimes, or very often, requires a state of equanimity, a state where there are neutral feelings present. And I do spend hours each day reading. I still am reading a lot. I still am participating in online communities, for example, in Discord server, and answering people's questions from different angles so that I can teach better and understand better. I am spending hours each day pondering in the past. So if I would summarize my practice, then I would say that the majority of my day is directed towards Dhamma. I wouldn't be surprised when the most important thing each day is actually the practice of Dhamma. Like 6 to 8 hours each day. And if it is just background pondering on things or being mindful during everyday life, there is a lot of that going on. It is not just the sitting on the meditation cushion. This is a very important point here. And I also spend hours each day, sometimes, not all days are structured the same, formulating and sorting the knowledge that I have attained so that I can teach it to other people. And for me, this is also practice. All of this is a lifestyle. Dhamma overall is and should be a lifestyle, and it is not just sitting in meditation on the meditation cushion. It is everything. Watching Dhamma talks online, watching lectures online, reading books about Dhamma, making sense of the teaching, making sense of your experiences. This is the stuff that you have to understand. And I will give you an overview over my practice personally in a lot of detail and what I did wrong in the upcoming slides. But for now, here's let's say a practice record of another person who had an email correspondence with Nanamoli, a monk that I greatly respect from the Hillside Hermitage. And I find that actually very insightful for people who are still practicing Dhamma before stream entry, as an example, and are encountering lots of problems. Because that person, I think he's Matthias from Germany, had a lot of problems before he made a breakthrough to the Dhamma. And he's a very philosophical kind of person who really has to understand, who had trouble practicing. But as you will see, he attained the right view without any formal practice, by the way. People always say that it is necessary to perform methods, but that is not true. In the end, it is an understanding, and understanding does not require you to sit on a meditation cushion. It can be beneficial depending on your character and on your preconditions and what you like and dislike, but it's not a necessity. And if you really just sit to feel good, then you should really contemplate if it is the right thing to do. Because any type of intentional activity that you do for the purpose of gaining pleasure will strengthen craving. And strengthening craving means that you cannot see the Dhamma. Because the Dhamma can only be seen when there is no craving, or very, very weak craving. And this is a long exchange, by the way. It spans over a few hundred of pages. But again, it can really help people to have very tangible examples in their experience that they can compare themselves with. The example is rather extreme in there, by the way. The person had a very intense, let's call it dark night, because the Buddha named Ananda named 4 kinds of people who make a breakthrough to the Dhamma. The first kind of person is a person who develops serenity first, and then discernment, another person develops discernment first, and then serenity, and yet another person develops both at once, and then there is a person who is driven by mental restlessness and worry and anxiety to practice, and at some point they are settling in the Dhamma. So that is that type of person. And it's not the nicest kind of feeling when it comes to that progress record, but it's a very special case in my opinion. There are not many people who had such a negative experience. When I think back to my practice, then it was not as dreadful as his, and it was not filled with such difficulty. It was difficult, there's no question about it, but it was not difficult on that level. And if you want to, you can either type the URL into your browser or scan the QR code. Okay, let us see what the next slide might be. This slide is more about my personal practice, but I think it is a good point in time to stop here, and the rest of the lecture will be done next time. So then we will go through my own practice, what I did wrong, what I did right, what changed for me, and all those things, just to give you a very open overview about what I did. And believe me, I fell for very many wrong things in my practice that I had to clean up later, before I found to the suttas. Because in the end, I wanted to find out what Buddhism is really about. And at some point, I have encountered so many false teachings that were leading me nowhere that I just decided to read the entirety of the Pali Canon that is more or less trusted, and just ordered all the books and read them. And then at some point it clicked and I understood all those things that the Buddha was talking about. But it really required all the suttas. Anyway, as always, now is a good time for questions and answers and open points that remain after this lecture. So if there's anything that is unclear, feel free to post a comment in the comment section of YouTube. Please open a new comment so that YouTube informs me about your question. And then I will collect those questions and do a Q&A video at the end of the lecture series with a noble friend of mine. He has a very good philosophical background, while I'm more of a person who does not possess that background. So we have different angles from which we can answer, and thus we can hopefully supply a very beneficial answer for every type of person. Okay, but apart from that, I want to thank you for making it till the end. If you know anyone who would profit from such a lecture, feel free to share it with them. Also feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you suspect any benefit for you. But apart from that, I think that is enough for today. Thank you again for watching. Have a nice day, and maybe until next week, which will be the last official lecture of the series. Have a nice day and goodbye.